The words landed like shards of broken glass. My mother, Susan, stood in her perfectly tidy kitchen, hands gripping the cool marble counter, her face contorted with a fury I'd seen gathering for months. "I wish you were never born," she hissed, each syllable precise, venomous. Everything stopped. The kitchen clock seemed to hold its breath. Outside, even the birds fell silent. Inside my chest, something vital just shattered. "Then consider me dead," I replied, my voice eerily calm, not even my own. Without another word, I walked out of that house and never looked back. That was 3 years ago. What happened next turned my entire family inside out. My name didn't matter to them anymore. Growing up, I was always the difficult one. The daughter who asked too many questions and refused to fall in line. My older sister, Chloe, was everything our parents wanted. Compliant, beautiful, married to a successful executive named David, with 2 adorable kids, Sarah and Ethan. They lived in a sprawling house in the city's outskirts, drove matching luxury SUVs, and posted family photos that looked ripped from a catalog. I was the opposite in every measurable way. I became a trauma nurse, working night shifts at an inner-city hospital. I wore scrubs instead of designer dresses. My apartment was small, but it was mine. I dated occasionally, but never seriously enough for Susan's approval. According to her endless commentary, I was wasting my life, throwing away my potential, embarrassing the family with my choices. The breaking point came during what was supposed to be a celebration dinner for my 30th birthday. My parents, Frank and Susan, had insisted on hosting it at their country club. Chloe arrived with her picture-perfect family. I showed up alone, still wearing mascara from a shift that had run 4 hours over because we'd had 3 trauma cases back-to-back. Susan took one look at me, and her mouth tightened into that familiar line of disappointment. Throughout dinner, she made cutting remarks about my appearance, my career, my lack of a husband and children. When dessert arrived, she started in on how I'd always been difficult, always making everything harder than it needed to be. "Maybe if you'd actually tried to be part of this family instead of always fighting us," she said, her voice rising, "you wouldn't be alone and miserable." I set down my fork carefully. I'm not miserable. I save lives. I'm good at my job. I'm happy. You're delusional, she shot back. Frank sat silent, as he always did when Susan went on the attack. Chloe studied her wineglass like it contained the secrets of the universe. The argument escalated in the parking lot afterward. Susan followed me out, unable to let it drop. She kept pushing, kept attacking, kept trying to convince me that everything about my life was wrong. When I refused to engage, when I simply tried to get in my car and leave, she screamed those words. So, I gave her what she wanted. The first month was the hardest. I blocked their numbers, deleted social media accounts they could access, changed my email. I told exactly 3 people where I'd gone: my best friend, Emily, from nursing school, my supervisor at the hospital, and my landlord. I continued working, continued living, continued existing in a world where my parents simply weren't part of the equation. Emily kept me sane during those early weeks. "They'll realize what they've lost," she said over coffee one morning. "Give it time." But time passed, and nothing changed. Through Emily, who remained connected to mutual acquaintances, I heard occasional updates. My parents told people I'd moved away for work. They didn't mention the fight or the estrangement. Chloe apparently asked about me once, then never again. They simply edited me out of the family narrative like I'd never existed. 6 months in, I actually started to heal. Therapy helped. So did throwing myself into work and building a life that belonged entirely to me. I started dating Leo, a paramedic I'd met during a particularly brutal shift. We took things slow, both of us carried our own burdens. He never pushed about my family. When I finally told him the abbreviated version, he just held my hand and said, "Their loss." The freedom was intoxicating in ways I hadn't anticipated. Simple decisions, what to eat, where to go, how to spend my weekends, became exercises in rediscovering my own preferences without someone constantly criticizing them. I'd forgotten what it felt like to make choices without bracing for judgment. Leo noticed the small ways I still flinched, still second-guessed myself, still apologized for things that didn't warrant apology. You don't have to say sorry for ordering what you want, he pointed out one evening at a restaurant. I'd apologized to the server for changing my mind about a side dish. The observation hit harder than it should have. How many years had I spent apologizing for existing in ways that didn't match Susan's vision? How much of my personality had been shaped by trying to minimize the target on my back? Work became my sanctuary in new ways. I'd always loved nursing, but without the constant drain of family stress, I found myself volunteering for additional training. I took a position on the hospital's trauma committee. My supervisor, Dr. Evans, noticed the change during my performance review. "Whatever you're doing differently, keep it up," she said. "You've always been skilled, but lately there's something else. Confidence, maybe. Presence." What she was seeing was someone no longer carrying the weight of constantly proving her worth to people who'd decided long ago she had none. The energy I'd spent trying to earn Susan's approval could now fuel my actual goals. I started taking classes toward becoming a nurse practitioner. Leo supported every step, never once suggesting I was being too ambitious or asking too much. Through Emily, I learned bits and pieces about what was happening in the family I'd left behind. Susan had apparently told her book club that I'd taken a position overseas and was too busy to visit. The lie was elaborate. She created entire stories about my fictional life in Paris, working at some prestigious hospital. Frank went along with it, as he went along with everything. "It's actually impressive," Emily said, showing me screenshots from a mutual acquaintance's social media. "She's built this whole alternate reality where you're thriving abroad, and she's the proud mother supporting your international career." The absurdity would have been funny if it wasn't so revealing. Susan couldn't admit to her social circle that her daughter had chosen to leave. She couldn't face the questions that truth would raise about her own behavior. So, she manufactured a narrative where she remained the good mother, and my absence was circumstantial rather than chosen. Chloe's situation was deteriorating steadily. Through the occasional text she sent, always brief, always careful, I could see the pressure mounting. Susan had started showing up at Sarah's school, volunteering for events without asking permission. She cornered David at his office Christmas party, making a scene about not seeing enough of the grandchildren. When Chloe tried to establish visiting schedules and boundaries, Susan acted like she was being unreasonably restricted from her own family. "She told me I'm keeping her grandchildren hostage," Chloe texted one night, "because I said she can't just show up at our house unannounced anymore." I wanted to tell Chloe to cut them off completely. But I'd learned that revelation had to come from within. You can't force someone to see what they're not ready to acknowledge. All I could do was be available when Chloe needed to talk and refrain from pushing. 8 months after our first coffee meeting, Chloe called me at 2 a.m. I was awake anyway, winding down after a particularly rough shift where we'd lost a patient despite our best efforts. Her voice was thick with tears. "David and I had a massive fight. He wants to move us to Seattle where his brother lives. He says we need to get away from mom and dad, but that's where the kids' school is, where our life is." I told him he's overreacting. "Is he?" I asked gently. The question opened floodgates. Chloe detailed incident after incident. Susan criticizing her parenting in front of the children. Frank making passive comments about their life choices. The constant unsolicited advice that was really just veiled judgment. David had reached his breaking point months ago. Chloe had been holding on, trying to manage everyone's feelings, attempting to keep the peace. "I'm exhausted," she whispered. "I'm so tired of trying to make everyone happy." "You can't make her happy," I said, drawing on everything I'd learned in therapy. "Nothing you do will ever be enough, because the problem isn't you. It's her need to control, to criticize, to maintain power." I broke myself trying for years. You're doing the same thing. Chloe was quiet for a long time. I don't know how to stop. We talked until sunrise. I shared things I'd never told her, specific incidents from our childhood where Susan's behavior had been harsh, patterns I'd recognized only after getting distance. Chloe contributed her own memories. Pieces clicked into place as we compared experiences. The favoritism I'd perceived had been just as suffocating from the other side. Being the golden child meant living in constant fear of losing that status. She pits us against each other, Chloe realized aloud. Always has. You were the failure, so I had to be perfect. Now that you're gone, I'm failing because there's no one else to measure against. The manipulation was textbook narcissism, though neither of us used that term yet. We were just two daughters finally seeing the cage we'd been raised in. A year after I'd walked away, my parents held a huge celebration for their 35th wedding anniversary. Chloe posted photos online, which Emily showed me. There were no pictures of me in the montage displayed at the party. The family photo from when I was 12 had been cropped. I'd been erased so thoroughly, it was like I'd never been born at all. She got her wish, I told Leo that night. He kissed my forehead and reminded me I'd survived worse than being forgotten. What I didn't know was that my absence had created a vacuum. With me gone, Susan needed a new target for her controlling behavior. She turned her attention fully toward Chloe and her family. The criticism that had been split between two daughters now focused on one. The impossible standards, the constant judgment, the need to manage every detail of her children's lives, all of it landed squarely on Chloe's shoulders. David started pushing back first. According to what I learned later, he'd always disliked my parents, but tolerated them for Chloe's sake. Without me there to absorb some of the dysfunction, he began refusing to attend family dinners. This sparked arguments between him and Chloe, who spent her whole life trying to keep the peace. Susan responded by showing up unannounced at their house, criticizing Chloe's parenting, her housekeeping, her choices. She insisted on having keys to their home. When David had the locks changed, Susan showed up at his office and caused a scene in the lobby. The office incident was the turning point David needed. His boss called him into a private meeting afterward, gently suggesting that perhaps family issues needed to be resolved before they impacted his professional reputation. David was humiliated. More than that, he was furious. He'd spent years biting his tongue for Chloe's sake, and now Susan's dysfunction was threatening his career. He gave Chloe an ultimatum that night: either she set firm boundaries with consequences, or he was taking the Seattle job, and the kids were coming with him. Chloe could choose to join them or stay behind. He wouldn't actually split up our family, Chloe told me over the phone, her voice shaking. That's just the anger talking. Are you sure? I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, he's a man who's been pushed past his limit by a mother-in-law who won't respect basic boundaries. And you keep choosing her feelings over his. The silence stretched between us. Finally, Chloe said, I'm not choosing her. Then what are you doing? She didn't have an answer. Not then. But the question gnawed at her, forcing her to examine what keeping the peace was actually costing. Her marriage was fracturing. Her children were developing anxiety responses. Her own mental health was deteriorating. She'd started taking sleep aids because she'd lie awake rehearsing conversations with Susan, trying to find the magical combination of words that would make her mother reasonable. The next incident happened at Ethan's 6th birthday party. Chloe had specifically told Susan the party was small, just family and a few of Ethan's closest friends from school. Susan showed up with an enormous cake, much larger and more elaborate than the one Chloe had ordered, and announced she'd invited several of her book club friends who wanted to see the grandchildren. David physically blocked her at the door. You weren't invited to bring guests, he said, voice flat and cold. And we already have a cake. Susan tried to push past him. When he didn't budge, she raised her voice, making a scene in front of the neighborhood kids and their parents who were arriving. She called David controlling, accused Chloe of allowing herself to be manipulated, demanded to see her grandchildren. Chloe stood in the doorway, frozen. She could see the other parents watching, could see Sarah's face pressed against the window inside, could see her husband's barely contained rage. Something finally clicked into place. "Leave," Chloe said. Her voice didn't shake. "You need to leave right now." Susan turned on her. "You would choose him over your own mother after everything I've sacrificed for you? What exactly have you sacrificed?" The question came out harder than Chloe intended. "Money? You haven't given us money. Time? You only spend time with us so you can criticize how we're living. Love? Because this doesn't feel like love, Mom. This feels like control." The street had gone quiet. Every parent dropping off their kid was watching. Susan's face cycled through shock, fury, then calculated hurt. "I'm trying to help you," she said, switching tactics. "I'm trying to be a good grandmother." "Good grandmothers respect boundaries," David interjected. "Good grandmothers don't show up uninvited with guests and replacement cakes. Good grandmothers don't terrorize their children with constant criticism and then play victim when called out." Frank, who'd been sitting in the car during this confrontation, finally emerged. He looked older than his 62 years, worn down by decades of managing Susan's moods. "Let's just go," he said quietly. "This isn't the time or place." "This is exactly the time and place." Susan snapped. "Our daughter is being poisoned against us, and you're just going to stand there?" Frank met Chloe's eyes across the lawn. Something passed between them. An acknowledgement, maybe, or an apology. Then he took Susan's arm and guided her back to the car. She went, but not without a parting shot. "You'll regret this," she called to Chloe. "Both of you will regret treating family this way." Chloe called me that night after the party ended, after the kids were asleep, after she and David had their first honest conversation in months about what came next. "I need to know how you did it," she said. "No preamble, no small talk, the actual mechanics of cutting them off, because I think we're there." I walked her through everything, blocking numbers, managing social media, preparing for the extinction burst, that final desperate escalation before someone with control issues finally accepts they've lost power. I explained about the guilt, the doubt, the moments where you question whether you're overreacting. I told her about therapy, about learning to trust her own perception of reality after years of emotional manipulation. "It's going to get worse before it gets better," I warned. "She's going to try everything, apologies that aren't real apologies, threats, playing the victim to mutual friends and family, showing up places. You have to be prepared to hold the line." "I'm scared," Chloe admitted. "What if I'm making a mistake? What if you're not?" I countered. "What if this is the thing that saves your marriage and gives your kids a chance to grow up without this toxicity?" David took the phone from Chloe. We'd never been particularly close before, but his voice was warm with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for showing her it was possible," he said. "I've been begging her to set boundaries for years, but she needed to see it could be done." "I didn't do it for her," I reminded him. "I did it for me, but I'm glad it helps." After we hung up, Leo found me staring out our apartment window at the city lights below. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, chin resting on my shoulder. "You okay?" he asked. "My sister is about to blow up her relationship with our parents," I said. "Because of me." "Because of them," he corrected gently. "Because they created a situation so toxic that both their daughters independently decided distance was necessary for survival. That's not your fault or Chloe's fault. That's on them." Intellectually, I knew he was right. Emotionally, the old programming kicked in. The belief that family problems were my responsibility to fix, that setting boundaries made me selfish, that I should try harder to make it work. Therapy had helped, but that voice never completely disappeared. I almost didn't answer the unknown number when it rang one Tuesday afternoon, but something made me pick up. "I need to talk to you," she said without preamble. Her voice sounded hollow, scraped raw. "Can we meet?" We chose neutral ground, a coffee shop halfway between our respective neighborhoods. Chloe looked exhausted when she walked in, dark circles under her eyes, her usually perfect appearance somehow diminished. We sat in uncomfortable silence before she finally spoke. "You were right to leave." I didn't say anything, just waited. The story poured out. After I disappeared, Susan had become progressively worse. The control, the criticism, the boundary violations, everything had intensified. David was threatening to move them out of state. Sarah had started having anxiety attacks. Ethan asked why Grandma was always angry. Frank remained his usual passive self, enabling every bit of Susan's behavior. "I told her to back off last week," Chloe continued, hands wrapped tight around her untouched coffee. "She said I was being ungrateful after everything they'd done for us. When I pointed out they hadn't actually done anything except criticize and interfere, she lost it completely. Susan had said things during that fight that couldn't be unsaid. She called Chloe a failure, called David an inadequate provider despite his six-figure salary, said the grandchildren were being raised poorly. When David stepped in to defend his wife, Susan had turned on him with particular viciousness. She told me I should be more like you," Chloe said, and laughed bitterly. The daughter she wished had never been born. "Apparently, now you're the standard I'm failing to meet." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Chloe wanted to know how I'd done it, how I'd simply cut them off and survived. I told her the truth. It had been brutal at first, but ultimately liberating. I explained therapy, boundaries, building a chosen family from friends who actually supported me. She listened like I was describing life on another planet. "I don't know if I can do it," she admitted. "They're still my parents." "They're still mine, too," I replied. "But that doesn't mean they get to destroy me." We started meeting regularly after that. Chloe didn't cut contact immediately, but she began setting boundaries. When Susan pushed back, Chloe held firm. The explosion was spectacular. Susan called Chloe ungrateful, selfish, a terrible daughter. She threatened to cut them off financially, except they didn't actually provide any financial support. It was a completely empty threat that revealed how little power she actually held. Frank finally spoke up during one of these confrontations. According to Chloe, he told Susan she needed to stop before she lost both daughters. Susan's response was to accuse him of being weak and taking our side. Their marriage, which had always operated on his silent compliance to her dominance, started showing cracks. They separated briefly, with Frank moving into a hotel for 2 weeks. During that separation, Frank reached out to Chloe and apologized. A real apology, not the non-apology kind Susan specialized in. He admitted he'd failed both his daughters by not protecting us from Susan's detrimental influence. He didn't ask for forgiveness or immediate reconciliation, just acknowledged his failures. Chloe cried when she told me about that conversation. "I never thought he'd actually take responsibility," she said. 3 years after I'd walked out of my mother's kitchen, I got a letter in the mail. Actual physical mail, forwarded from my old address. The handwriting was Frank's. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I could bring myself to open it. Leo didn't push, just reminded me that whatever it contained, I could handle it. When I finally tore it open, my hands were shaking. Inside was a single page. He wrote that he and Susan were still together, but in separate rooms. Counseling had helped him recognize patterns he'd ignored for decades. He understood if we never wanted relationships with them again. He just wanted us to know he was proud of both his daughters for becoming strong enough to set boundaries he'd never learned to establish. The last line gutted me. "Your mother said she wished you'd never been born, but I'm grateful every day that you were. I'm sorry I never said so until it was too late." I read the letter twice, then a third time, searching for hidden manipulation or strings attached. But it seemed genuine in a way Frank had never been before. The man who'd spent my entire childhood staying silent while Susan tore me apart was finally speaking up. "Oh," Leo read over my shoulder, his breath warm against my neck. "That's a real apology. No justifications, no shifting blame, just acknowledgement and regret." Part of me wanted to crumple it up, to protect myself from the hope it sparked. The safer response was to maintain walls, to refuse any crack in my armor. But another part of me, the part that had spent years in therapy learning to recognize genuine change versus manipulation, saw something different in those words. Frank had been an enabler, complicit in his silence. But enablers could change. Sometimes they did the work. I showed the letter to Dr. Riley during my next therapy session. She read it carefully, then looked up at me with her therapist face, the one that meant she was about to say something important. "What do you want to do with this?" she asked. "I don't know." Part of me wants to respond. Part of me thinks it's too late, that he doesn't deserve my forgiveness after decades of letting her destroy me. Dr. Riley nodded slowly. "Those things can both be true. He doesn't deserve your forgiveness, and you might still choose to offer a response, not for him, or for you, but because it might help your healing." The conversation spiraled into deeper territory. We discussed the difference between reconciliation and acknowledgement, between forgiving someone and allowing them back into your life. Dr. Riley helped me see that responding to Frank didn't mean I had to rebuild a relationship or trust him with anything important. "You get to set the terms," she reminded me, something she'd said countless times. "Every boundary, every interaction, every expectation. This is your healing journey, not his redemption arc." I sat with the letter for 2 more weeks before crafting a response. It went through 7 drafts, each one getting shorter as I stripped away the parts that were trying to manage his feelings or soften my truth. The final version was simple. I acknowledged his apology. I said I appreciated his honesty but wasn't ready for more contact. I told him I'd built a good life, met someone who loved me, found work that mattered. I said, maybe someday we could try to build something, but it would take time and genuine change. His response came quickly, simple and respectful. "I understand. I'll be here if you're ever ready." Something about that exchange loosened a knot I'd been carrying. I didn't have to make immediate decisions about my father. I could leave the door cracked without flinging it wide open. I could acknowledge progress without rewarding it with instant access. Chloe noticed the shift during our next coffee date. "You seem lighter," she observed. "What changed?" I showed her Frank's letter and my response. She read both, tears sliding down her face. "He sent me something similar," she admitted. "I didn't know if he'd reached out to you, too." "I've been meeting with him occasionally. Just coffee, nothing heavy." "He's actually trying." This was news to me. Chloe had been protecting me from the details, worried that any mention of maintaining contact with Frank would feel like a betrayal. I assured her it didn't. "You get to make your own choices about this," I said, echoing Dr. Riley's words. "Your relationship with them doesn't have to look like mine." We talked through the complexities of selective contact. How Chloe was maintaining a careful relationship with Frank while keeping Susan at a complete distance. How Frank had accepted this arrangement without trying to negotiate on Susan's behalf. How strange it felt to have a father who was finally acting like a father, even if it was decades too late. "He asked about you at our last meeting," Chloe said. "Nothing pushy, just that he hoped you were happy. When I told him you were engaged, he got this look, pride mixed with regret. He said he wished he could walk you down the aisle." The statement hit harder than I expected. I'd never imagined my father at my wedding. I'd written him off along with Susan, bundled them together as a unit that needed to be excised from my life. The idea that he might deserve separate consideration hadn't occurred to me until recently. "I don't know if I can do that," I admitted. "Having him there would feel like forgiveness he hasn't earned yet." Chloe squeezed my hand. Then don't. Your wedding, your rules. But I wanted you to know he's trying. What you do with that information is entirely up to you. I showed the letter to Leo, who'd proposed to me the month before. We were planning a small wedding, just close friends. No family drama, no pressure, no guests who'd spend the reception criticizing our choices. Do you want to invite him? Leo asked carefully. I thought about it for a long time. No, I finally said. But I might write him back. I did write back. I told Frank I appreciated his honesty but wasn't ready for more contact. I told him I'd built a good life, met someone who loved me, found work that mattered. I said, maybe someday we could try to build something, but it would take time and genuine change. His response was simple, I understand. I'll be here if you're ever ready. Chloe came to my wedding. So did David and the kids, who barely remembered their aunt but were excited about the flower girl and ring bearer responsibilities. Emily was my maid of honor. The whole thing was small and perfect and entirely free of the toxicity that had defined my first 30 years. Sarah asked me at the reception why her other grandparents weren't there. I knelt down to her level and gave her the truth in age-appropriate terms. Sometimes grown-ups don't know how to be kind to each other. Your mom and I had to step away from some family members who weren't treating us well. It's sad, but it was the right choice. She processed this with a seriousness only a 9-year-old can muster. Like when I had to stop being friends with Maya because she was always mean? Exactly like that, I confirmed. At the end of the night, Chloe pulled me aside. Thank you for showing me it was possible to leave, she said. I would have stayed miserable forever if you hadn't walked away first. I didn't do it for you, I admitted. I did it for me, but I'm glad it helped. She hugged me tight. Still, thank you. A few months later, I heard through Chloe that Susan had finally started genuine therapy. Not couples counseling to fix her marriage, but individual therapy to address her controlling behavior and the childhood trauma that fueled it. Frank said she was actually making progress, actually doing the work. She asked if she could write to you, Chloe told me over coffee. I said I'd ask, but you didn't owe her anything. I thought about my mother standing in that kitchen, rage twisting her features, wishing I'd never existed. I thought about the relief I'd felt walking away. I thought about the life I built in her absence, brick by brick, into something sturdy and mine. Not yet, I said. Maybe someday. But not yet. Chloe nodded. That's what I figured you'd say. The truth is, I don't know if I'll ever be ready to let them back in. Some damage goes too deep to fully repair. The mother who wished I'd never been born can't simply be replaced by one who regrets saying it. Trust isn't rebuilt through apologies alone. But here's what I learned during these 3 years. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is give someone exactly what they claim to want. My mother wished I'd never been born. I gave her a world where I effectively didn't exist. In doing so, I proved I didn't need her validation or approval to survive. I could build a life without her that was better than anything she'd imagined for me. The chaos that followed wasn't my responsibility to manage. Susan had to face the consequences of driving away both daughters. Frank had to reckon with decades of enabling. Chloe had to learn the boundaries I'd already established. My family had to function without the scapegoat who'd absorbed so much dysfunction. And me? I got exactly what I actually needed: distance, peace, and the freedom to become whoever I wanted to be. Last week, I found out I'm pregnant. Leo and I are cautiously excited, and also terrified, because that's apparently normal. Emily is already planning the baby shower. Chloe offered to share all her old baby equipment. My coworkers at the hospital are placing bets on whether it's a boy or girl. Chloe asked if I'd tell our parents once the baby arrives. I told her, honestly, I don't know. This child will grow up surrounded by love from people who chose to be in our lives. Maybe that includes grandparents who've genuinely changed. Maybe it doesn't. The choice is mine to make, on my timeline. Because that's the thing about walking away from toxic family, you get to decide what reconciliation looks like, if it happens at all. You get to set the terms. You get to prioritize your own well-being and the well-being of the family you're creating. My mother wished I'd never been born. Instead, she got something more poetic, a daughter who was born again, this time into a life she chose for herself. The chaos was just the sound of a fundamentally unhealthy system finally collapsing under its own weight. And honestly, that's better than anything I could have planned. What new boundaries have you had to establish to protect your own peace?